I'm the director of the Iran program here at the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C., and pleased to welcome you all to today's event, Iran and Taliban readying for war. What is different this time? Question mark. Tensions between Iran and Taliban have been rising in recent months, including border skirmishes that have resulted in the deaths of military forces from both sides of the border. Iran has blamed Taliban's unprofessionalism, while just today I was reading that Taliban's defense minister is blaming Iran. Each time, as the likelihood of military conflict has grown, both sides have decided to de-escalate. But there are some real deep-rooted obstacles that very likely means Iran-Taliban relations will remain difficult in the foreseeable future. This includes a disagreement over the use of water from the Helmand River, Tehran's non-recognition of Taliban, and Taliban's overall anti-Iran stance, or at least history of, including anti-Shia positions. Our panel today will discuss these and many other issues in the next hour. MEI is delighted to welcome our three guest experts for this conversation. In the interest of time, I will introduce them by name and affiliation only, but you can see their full bios on the page for this event on the MEI website. First, we have Fatemeh Aman, who is a non-resident senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute. Next, we have Dr. Niloufar Sakhi, who is a professional lecturer at George Washington University and a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, also in Washington, D.C. Last but not least, we have Andrew Watkins, who is a senior expert on Afghanistan at the United States Institute of Peace, also from Washington, D.C. I encourage everyone to submit your questions. Please use Zoom's Q&A feature. I'll be looking for as many of your questions and include them, if possible, into the conversation. So please don't be shy. Do send those questions over. And with that, let's start. I will start with Fatemeh. If you could set the stage, tell us where we are today, how we ended up here, what has been the main drivers in Iran-Taliban relations over the last about 2 years. Taliban has returned to power. And I will then send that same question to Niloufar, and then we'll go to Andrew. So Fatemeh, floor is yours. Please go ahead.
Unmute. Thank you, MEI and Alex, for this great and very timely event, and also thank you for including me. Iran and the Taliban have never been friends, have never liked each other, have never trusted each other. They tolerated and used each other, basically, against a common enemy, which in this case is United States. As you mentioned, they almost went to war in the 1990s, but IRGC, Supreme Leader, and then the government of then President Mohammad Khatami decided not to enter Afghan soil, which turned out to be a good decision. So I want to skip the 90s and the first Taliban rule. I will just jump to more recent and I believe more significant time in the relationship between Iran and the Taliban. In 2015, with the emergence of ISKP insurgents, which, by the way, Iran takes extremely serious, the threat of ISKP and their infiltration into Iran. And they concluded that then Afghan government was ineffective, not effective enough in confronting the ISKP. So Iranian started to get actively engaged with the Taliban and also tried to expand their influence within the group. The Hizb Vilayat Islami, or the Party of Islamic Guardianship, was formed, which is more Iran leaning within the Taliban. And then later they also got involved in the intra-Afghan negotiations, inviting Taliban delegation, one after the other. I think they had a constant spot at Tehran's hotels. They also included Afghan officials and let them sit down and negotiate. Their best case scenario around that time was a government that is, that Taliban is part of it, but they would also, that government would also include some Iran-leaning factions. So it didn't happen. And to everyone's surprise, to everyone's shock, Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, and then the Iranians had the, heavy task to sell it to the public. As you know, in the 90s, they were described as Wahhabi terrorists in power. Now they had to sell it to the public that they have, they claimed, portrayed them as more civilized compared to the previous generation of the Taliban. And eventually then, despite the resentment from the public opinion in Iran, they accepted the Taliban got a little bit closer, and ultimately they handed over Afghanistan embassy in Tehran, Afghanistan consulate in Mashhad. But let me also come to the issues that's more recent in the last few weeks. Two things happen simultaneously, two things that are not necessarily connected. One is, as you mentioned, the clashes at the border. This is not unprecedented. It has happened in 2008, 2009, during presidency of government of Hamid Karzai and later Ashraf Ghani. So it's not something that happened with Taliban coming to power. The other one is a dispute, an old, over 150 years old dispute over border, shared transboundary border, as you mentioned, Helmand, or what Iran call it, Hirman. So most recently, the flow of water has been kind of manipulated, and with Mr. Raisi coming out, sending warnings to the Taliban, which was ridiculed by the Taliban's official later. So basically taking a firm tone, which didn't work properly. It made the issue even worse. So right now things have calmed down, and but it can happen quickly, very quickly. Now, the difference was that these two things happened at the same time. I can understand why some in the media, wrote or claimed that the dispute, the war, the clashes at the border was because, or was connected, was due to the dispute over water. They have been completely separated from each other, but they obviously, with the disastrous water management in Iran, and then the also impact of the climate change, things can happen very quickly and can lead to more serious events, basically.
Thank you.
I will end it here.
Yeah, no, thank you. I'll move over to Niloufar and ask her the same question in terms of describing the main issues in the last 2 years or so, but please feel free to provide historical context as well, to the extent that you think is relevant from Afghan side, just the way Fatima did from the Iranian perspective. But Fatima, before I go to Niloufar, one quick question. This is interesting. If I remember right, if memory serves me correct, before he left, former Iranian Foreign Minister Javad Zarif basically complained that there was a faction in the Islamic Republic that had been hosting, you mentioned hotels, this is why this question came up, been hosting members of the Taliban in various hotels in Tehran without necessarily the knowledge of the Iranian Foreign Ministry. Folks like the now deceased General Qasem Soleimani had been actively trying to see if they could resurrect part of the old Northern Alliance components, including his Ahmad Shah Massoud's son. Ahmad Massoud. So very quickly, Fatih, in terms of the consensus in Tehran, who runs the Afghan policy? I mean, is it the security forces? Is it the Revolutionary Guards? Is it the Quds Force?
Yeah, before I answer this question, I have to mention that Mr. Zarif himself had met with the Taliban delegations numerous times, both Shamkhani, Zarif. Maybe you mean before the relationship got more public, and yeah, I can imagine that they have been in touch. They never cut ties, actually. When Afghanistan was occupied, and events that I think Nilufar may want to mention so that I don't talk too much, but they provided the Taliban insurgents with explosive or whatever would be useful to make the Americans staying in Afghanistan hard and more difficult. And later, as I mentioned, they also tried to expand their influence, and they eventually came to, hosting them like government, like a statesman. But let me tell you something, that the policies of Iran toward Afghanistan, generally South Asia, but specifically Afghanistan, has not changed under any government that came to power after the revolution. They all, consider Afghanistan, Iran borders very porous and very sensitive. But now with the emergence of ISK, as I mentioned, the issue has become more serious. And that could be the defining factor, of Iran-Taliban relation for years to come.
Thank you.
If they stay in power for so long.
Thank you for that. Nilufar, please, your reactions, your comments, and this idea of how would we describe the last almost 2 years of Taliban in power vis-a-vis Iran?
Thank you. Thank you, Alex, for having me, and Middle East Institute for organizing this event. It's wonderful to be among friends here in this group and see a very long friend after a long time. When I discuss the countries, the Afghanistan neighboring countries, I first look at the interest of the neighboring countries. And then with the interest, whoever is in power, I try to calculate and analyze how those interests would be executed by the neighboring countries and how the ruling power will negotiate those interests. I'll do the same in terms of the Taliban and Iran. Iran has three major interests in Afghanistan. That's around ideology, economic expansion, and security. They are the three thematic focus of Iran's strategic interest in Afghanistan. It has been always there. And for the ideological aspect, Iran has a deep concern right now in Afghanistan because of the Sunni majority group is in power. And already based on the history, Taliban's mistreatment of Afghans, Shia Hazara community has been a serious concern for Iranians, the Iran population and Iran government over a period of time. From an economic point of view, Iran, of course, wants Afghanistan to be both as a connector of this economic expansion with Central Asia, and also to be a market for its own product. That's from an economic angle. And from security, of course, Iran does not want violence, instability spill over to its borders. So there are three major interests that Iran will, I think, would cement its policies of engagement with Afghanistan ruling party, whoever will be, to maintain these three major interests that Iran has. Now, coming from, just getting back to your answer, to your question, Alex, from last 2 years, Iran, of course, they are not the friends of the Taliban due to major reasons, as I mentioned, especially the ideological reasons. And Iran, though Iran is blind to the Taliban's structure, as compared to the countries like Pakistan and Saudis, who have been so much engaged with the Taliban for the last many years, Iran is kind of, I see Iran doesn't have a deep understanding of the Taliban internal dynamics and the compositions. So with that said, Iran is still blind to the dynamics, how different factions within the Taliban would react to Iran in future and even now. So that information is missing from the table when Iran wants to cement its policy around the Taliban. So, but still, from last 2 years, soon after the Doha Agreement was signed, Iran invited the Taliban, Mullah Baradar in Tehran with its delegation. So what it says that I study countries in the region, and particularly Iran as well. Iran sees, at that point saw that, of course, Taliban will be the next power, and engaging with them would make more sense for Iranian leaders because of all the 3 areas of interest that I mentioned. This engagement means isolation of Iran in the region. So that Iran knew it from the very beginning, because Taliban's connection with Pakistan, with Saudis, and of course China would intervene. So all those other factions were there, where disengagement for Iran meant isolation of Iran in the region. So therefore Iran started working, of course informally, but through different platforms, with the Taliban, inviting them for a dialogue in Tehran. And I have read many bilateral, not agreements, but meetings between the two parties, between Iran and the Taliban from last 2 years, in order to make the environment friendly for partnership and cooperation from last 2 years. So that is there. So that is very interest-based. The relationship has been very interest-based, pragmatic for Iran with the Taliban. The same with the Taliban. Taliban from last 2 years, they tried their best to make the regional countries, including Iran, as friends, to show to the world that, well, they have good relationship with their neighbors, and because they are seeking recognition and money from international community, including the regional neighbors. So, but again, there are underlying factors that make this relationship complicated. There are, I just list a few factors, especially looking at the recent border crisis between the two countries. First is, I think, the bad governance and both sides, and Iran and Taliban side, and managing the borders, especially in terms of the recent water tension. We have seen that bad governance and environmental protection policies in Iran that I have at least followed, and also the government in Iran has failed to have effective regulation and sustainable policies towards water management. On the other hand, the Taliban exactly have the same problem. They have governance issues, they have management issues at the border, and they have diplomatically failed to manage the water crisis. Though, all of us know here that water tension between Iran and the Taliban is not new. It goes back to, years back after 1973, but during Republic, the same issues were there. And water, hydropolitics in Afghanistan was not given enough attention during the Republic time as well. That was always in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. That was always at the lower stage for the officials there. That was not paid much attention. And therefore, there was not a systematic policy of engagement with this particular issue during the Republic as well. So this is not new first. It goes back to the past. Secondly, bad governance on both sides, especially also now that we see in Iran, has caused this issue to arise. Taliban, on the other hand, they have, I think, from my perspective, they have a technical issue with the diplomacy. They are a militant group, and I think that that technicality, that nits and grids of diplomacy, strategic diplomacy, is missing from the group perspective. Therefore, they had problem with Pakistan at the border. They had border issues with Tajikistan. They had border issues with Uzbekistan. They had border issues now with Iran a couple of times since they have been in power. So looking at all this series of border crises and lack of management and governance, one thing can come up from a negotiation and diplomacy perspective, that they lack that technicality in order to manage the borders and protect the borders well. Let me stop there because there's a lot to add, and then I'll come back to my points during the discussion.
Thank you, Niloufar. That was wonderful. I'll come back to you on water, but I do have a very quick follow-up before I go to Andrew. The question I had for you was, you talked about which I thought stood out for me. You said Iran is blind in terms of the internal dynamics in Afghanistan. This is quite damning for the Islamic Republic, which takes pride in having 16 or whatever it is number of intelligence services. And here's Afghanistan, a country that is on the brink, or has been for so long. And you would think a neighboring state like Iran would invest more energy trying to figure out what's going on in Afghanistan, and yet they're busy elsewhere in the Arab world. And so can you just say a few more words about what it is that is such a big disadvantage for Iran when you describe them as being blind in terms of the factional competition that might be going on, I'm sure, going on inside of the Taliban?
Well, it depends really on how the Taliban will move on and how they'll go on. If the Taliban will stay longer, Iran doesn't have a choice to know more about the Taliban. Iran will, of course, engage itself further, try to use all the alliance building in the region in order to get more connected to the regional interests. But on the other hand, Iran will, in terms of the policy implementation, Iran doesn't have a choice, or any country in the region don't have a choice, because of two reasons. First, that don't have a choice of not engaging with the Taliban, because first, the proximity. I mean, it's they are in the same region. The proximity always makes country leave with no option rather than to engage and partner and collaborate. So I think the proximity, and second thing, the security threats, the ISKP and all the other non-affiliated groups that are emerging, the anti-Shia groups that are emerging, both in Afghanistan and in Balochistan of Pakistan. So, with all these dynamics coming up, I think Iran, if Taliban will stay longer, Iran will be more engaged with the Taliban in order to understand the dynamics better, and other, if there are factions within the Taliban, to take side of one of the factions that may go forward in order to execute or implement its interest. But I think engagement would be one of the paths, that closer engagement that Iran will pursue with the Taliban going forward.
Thank you. And Andrew, I had a question for you. Niloufar is describing the three main pillars in shaping relations in terms of ideology, economy, and security calculations. If you just look at the two components, security and economic calculations that each have towards the other, how in an ideal world can we perhaps see these two countries, put more emphasis on economic cooperation and less focus on their security differences? Now, this is a question for you, but please, by all means, start off by reacting to whatever you heard Fatemeh and Niloufar say and whatever you wanted to share with us in this first instance. So, Andrew, floor is yours.
Thank you, Alex, and thanks to MEI again for this well-timed panel. It's great to be here with friends and colleagues. Some great points already raised. I don't want to stray too far from your question, which is key. But I appreciated, as Fatemeh talked us through some of the history of Iran's engagement, Niloufar's part of what she contributed is worth emphasizing, that at least from the standpoint of watching Afghanistan closely, Iran's engagement with the Taliban does seem to have predated their concerns about ISIS moving into South and Central Asia. And I think Niloufar said it perfectly. Some of this seems to just be attributed to Iran's interest in blocking US interests in Afghanistan, in nothing else playing spoiler. But there's also a trend, I think, across the region, especially after the United States began to openly announce its intent to withdraw from Afghanistan militarily. It named a date of 2014, but it began talking about this as early as 2010 and 11. And it was around that time that we saw a number of regional powers, including Russia and maybe even more cautiously China, began to increase their, at the time, perhaps covert engagement with the Taliban. And that became less about spoiling US objectives and was more about seeing the writing on the wall and understanding that they needed to hedge bets if the Islamic Republic did not have a future in a post-American Afghanistan. I also really appreciated Fatima's distinction between the water rights and tensions, as has been noted, not a new issue, and in fact, maybe a seasonal issue. It's no surprise that in January and February, Iranian officials were praising the Taliban for increasing the flow of water from the same river that today we hear such strong language on. And that's, of course, because of the impact of evaporation on the flow of the river as it moves into Sistan and some of the most arid regions of Iran. In some ways, climate change is the real factor here, much more than the behavior of Iran or Taliban, whatever their flaws in water management and political intrigue. And finally, I think moving into this question of how to focus on economic versus security concerns, it's worth pointing out that there's a mirror image in the domestic politics as far as both of these governing regimes look back to their supporters and their constituencies. Both in Iran and among the Taliban, both have reasons to appear tough against the other. The Taliban, because resisting foreign influence is part of their foundational ideology. It's what they've been fighting their 20-year insurgency against the Americans for, and it's what they also claim that they will do that no other Afghan government has done before, to resist foreign interference in Afghan affairs. And of course, Fatima has talked us through Iranian domestic concerns, and to Niloufar's point, the worry about the ideology of the Taliban at their core. So both deal with domestic politics that urge them to posture as tough. And Alex, to your opening comments, I think that makes it all the more remarkable that every time we see tensions flare up, both sides are eager to de-escalate. It's not often that states are so eager to de-escalate when their domestic politics might push them to be more hostile, or at least to appear more hostile. When it comes to security factors and trying to find a way to work around them on economic development, ironically, I think most of the drivers of conflict between Iran and the Taliban today are not major security concerns. The Taliban are willing, if not perfectly capable, of engaging with Iran and other regional powers to contain the Islamic State in the area. That's not because the Taliban are not also, a jihadist militant movement in many ways. In some ways, it's difficult to distinguish some of their ideology from the Islamic State and its propaganda. But they do see IS, Khorasan province, as a political threat and a threat to their monopoly of force in Afghanistan. And so Iran actually has a willing partner that feels threatened by the very same group that Iran perhaps sees as the highest threat in the region. The security threats and risks of rising tensions between the groups, I think Dr. Saki has pointed to it exactly. The Taliban have a deep professionalization problem in their security forces. As you noted, Alex, Iran has criticized that professionalism on the border, particularly when it comes to border security forces. It's difficult to survey the Taliban's security sector in detail. They're very secretive. But what we know just from people who do cross-border trade and who spend time at border crossings as researchers and merchants, the Taliban's border forces are still incredibly informal. Many do not yet have uniforms. Many have not been run through formalized training courses. Some are still reporting through an insurgency-era chain of command in a very loosely dispersed militant network. And so when Dr. Saki describes technical level diplomacy that is meant to solve problems down at the border with these individual border security forces, there are real gaps there. And I think we can leave it there. Happy to talk more about the economic realm later.
No, thank you. Andrew, I do have a quick follow-up for you, because I think all of you mentioned ISIS Khorasan as this major threat. from an Iranian perspective, from a Taliban perspective. Educate us. What is this group in terms of funding, in terms of how it's able to recruit? I mean, where does it come from? If you look at their actions, I mean, what I know is nothing but blowing up mosques and other buildings. I've never seen ISIS Khorasan do anything good. So how does this organization find any appeal where in Afghan society, and how do you combat it?
Yeah, we could dedicate an entire hour to that question. I'll try to give the very brief rundown. I think the most important observation, especially those who haven't been tracking the Islamic State Khorasan province closely, is that the group has performed almost a 180-degree transformation since its establishment. The group is rooted in the cross-border migration of Pakistani extremist militant groups. Around 2014, when the Pakistani military drove them out of many of the tribal areas along the Afghanistan-Pakistan border region. As they pushed them into areas of eastern Afghanistan, some of these groups began to seize on the global brand name of Daesh, of the Islamic State, that was growing so much in Iraq and Syria at the time. But since then, the Islamic State in Afghanistan has moved away. Not that it's not still deeply rooted in some of those cross-border Pakistani communities in eastern Afghanistan, but its recruitment now draws on non-Pashtun languages and communities, targeting Central Asian languages and communities trans-regionally, but also some of its heaviest recruitment is taking place in urban centers and university campuses. That's why we now see more suicide attacks and Islamic State activity in major urban hubs, even far away from where they've normally acted, including in Herat city, where they've never had much presence before. They're tapping into a new urban discontent, much more than anything we knew about the group, even just 3 or 4 years ago.
Thank you so much, Andrew. That was very important to underscore. Fatemeh and Niloufar, same question, but again, if you don't mind, from an Iran perspective and then from an Afghan perspective, the role, the centrality, everyone's touched on it, but let's return to water one more time. The Iranian side, I was reading some officials are describing potential disaster in the Sistan and Baluchistan province in the southeast in the next few months. How much of this is real? Andrew was talking about this is seasonal, it goes up, it comes down. Everyone's talk about bad governance. This issue has been going on for decades and decades and decades. So just quickly, the issue of water, is this sort of this rhetoric of going to war over water? How much of this is political showmanship and exaggerated rhetoric on the part of officials in Tehran and in Kabul? Again, from both perspectives. I'll start with you, Fatemeh, and then I'll go to Niloufar with the same question.
Sure. As both Andrew and Niloufar mentioned, both sides, both governments have used, internal sentiments to bolden their own positions. So the issue has been completely political in Afghanistan, even before the Taliban, and now, and also in Iran. There was a Majlis representative who once blamed migrants, Afghan refugees in Iran for lack of enough water. The problem is that the issue of water is not a new phenomenon. Iran has had a really disastrous water management. They have this food paranoia, food security paranoia. They have had experience. They have experienced the Taliban, first government of the Taliban that blocked the flow of water from Helmand into Iran. So they should have invested somehow in the last 40 years. They should have been prepared. But unfortunately, you cannot just blame everything on the Taliban. With the Taliban, I don't think they have any regards for international law, or there is, even without agreements, you would not have been able to do any, you won't be able to deal with the Taliban. But on the Iranian side, they failed to be prepared to be independent from share from transboundary water. You cannot just sit down and blame, the Taliban for the disaster that's going on in Sistan, Balochistan, unfortunately, and it's expanding everywhere else. You can't just, the experts have been warning for years that producing crops that require so much water is not suitable for a region, so dried up like Sistan and Balochistan. But unfortunately, the Iranian government doesn't have a bright record in dealing with people who warn about water and environment and other on similar issues. So the issue is very serious, but it's not something that happened overnight. They had enough time. They had so much time to adapt to the climate change, to lack of water, to a possible Taliban government coming to power. They didn't do anything.
Right. Very good points. I tend to agree with everything you said, Fatemeh. Niloufar, I'm going to try and integrate two questions before you get to answer the same question, essentially the role of water in those communities that are impacted in Afghanistan. The questions that I wanted to ask you is, which has come from members of the audience, the role of Russia and China in the Taliban-Iran relations, to the extent that you can comment on that. And more specifically, who is building the dam is the question that I'm being asked. And the questioner is referring to Central Asian sources that are reporting sighting of foreign workers, and then question mark, perhaps they're from China. But if feel free to comment on anything that you just heard me say.
Well, thank you, Alex. First of all, the impact of this, the whole water on Afghanistan, Iran, I think there is a vast impact. There is a severe impact, actually, both in Iran and Afghanistan. First, Iran, Sistan and Balochistan province is now a home to a vast dry land. Second, as a result of prolonged drought, it actually accelerated the shrinking of Hamoun Lake in Iran, and which is actually fed by the Helmand River. So that's another impact of it. And the third impact, this from and I'll come to Afghanistan as well, is all the villages around the lake in Iran, it disappeared. And there is the wildlife, vegetation, and livestock, agriculture, everything has been impacted in those villages. So for Iran, it is a serious issue. Now for Afghanistan, based on different, from last at least few days, there has been interviews with the farmers, with the inhabitants of the areas around in the same region. There is a severe water scarcity. The farms are turning into a dry land also in that part as well. And people don't have drinking water. So they are having issues with the drinking water as well. So there are all kinds of water-related issues that experts on water actually could highlight it very well based on their calculation and the interviews recently conducted. But at least as a summary, we see that it is a serious issue in both the countries. And I think it will turn into a security issue if it's not managed well. That's what I would analyze. Why? Because water insecurity is a security issue for the population on both the sides. And if population will pressure the government have to take actions. And that action, how it could be calculated, we have to wait and see for that. So that is an issue, that is a serious issue, which could be escalated into a serious security issue if it's not managed well. Why I'm not so open about its management or the water management or a diplomatic stance that could take towards the resolution of this problem is because the nature of the negotiation which is happening between the two countries. Taliban are talking from the position of power at this point. The way they negotiate with its regional partners, but anyone around, including Iran, is that we got the victory, we are the power, and we have the resources to fight as well. So they are talking from a fight perspective. There's less of, again, technical negotiations involved for issues to be resolved. There's more of positioning, power positioning at the table of talks that I at least followed between these actors from last 2 years, especially on border crisis. So therefore, I mean, if the same negotiation styles move on, if we don't see, unfortunately, we should not be very hopeful for a resolution of this problem in near future. Second, why it is not resolvable at this particular time? Because I think the 1973 treaty has to be reviewed, revised. That's another fundamental issue. And I think, and that then the third party should intervene, and UN could be the third party in such issues. And UN should intervene in order to bring the parties together and resolve it and review and revise the 1973 treaty. I think that is another fundamental underlying factor that could help a resolution for a long term. But for the short term, due to these two factors, especially now the Taliban as a ruling party with less negotiation skills and diplomatic technicalities, I think that would remain. This problem, as Andrew mentioned, will come again and again. It might settle down for a while, but it might come in again. And my concern is that spoilers will take advantage of this conflict. The unaffiliated fighters in the border areas or in the region could take, in future, if it's not settled well, could take advantage of this particular conflict. And that will make the conflict actually, in severe case, severe mood going forward. So that's my concern, that if it's not managed well and the time is not given to it as real management, I think that will transform into a security crisis, which the others will take advantage of it.
Thank you so much. And I see Andrew wants to comment. And Andrew, hang on to that comment. I have one question of my own. I'm being selfish, and two questions from the audience. Take as few minutes, seconds as you like, but it would be great if you could comment on them. One is Nilüfer is describing Taliban as we have the power, we do as we wish. But there's an economic reality that faces a country that's landlocked. And surely at some point when they're doing their basic economic calculations, they will look at Iran and say, well, at the very least, we need Iran as an outlet to world markets, port of Chabahar, for example, bring in goods from India and so forth. So there are minimum requirements, I assume, because what is the alternative in many ways? Central Asia, Pakistan, perhaps China? Maybe you could comment on the centrality of Iran as an economic outlet for anyone who rules in Kabul. And then two questions I want to throw at you, if you don't mind, Andrew. The role of this anti-American or anti-imperialist narrative that might bring Taliban and Iran together. And the other thing is specifically on Pakistan. What would be Pakistan's strategy in case of Iran-Taliban war? So those are the three questions. And then you had your own comment. Start with your own comment by all means.
Oh, sure. I thought it was worth a quick intervention. The question from the audience on foreign involvement in dam building, just a bit of a clarification, especially in Central Asian media. What folks are probably reading about is the Kush-Tepe Canal, which is taking place in northern Afghanistan and runs into the northern neighboring states, the Central Asian states. North of Afghanistan. There may be some construction projects taking place on dams along the Helmand or Harirud rivers that feed into Iran. But the major dams we're talking about for the Helmand River, as discussed by my colleagues, were finalized in early 2021, just months before the Taliban took over. And most, if not all of that, was supported by the United States and its other NATO and allied partners. But of course, as has been noted, the Kajaki Dam, the one really at the heart of the Helmand River, had been built and supported by the United States as early as the 1950s, prompting, a lot of the work on the 1973 treaty. Foreign involvement in the dams, especially for water that feeds into Iran, it isn't. I don't think it's a major factor. though it's certainly something that all the other neighboring states are watching closely to try and anticipate what their water management relationships will be with the Taliban. In terms of how Pakistan might react, not only am I not a specialist on Pakistan, the little bit that I understand from experts I speak to is that Pakistan is not even certain how to move forward with its engagement with the Taliban in the current moment, much less in future worst case scenarios of war or regional conflict. Pakistan has such a dilemma on its hands. The Taliban are not behaving the way the Pakistani security establishment had hoped or expected they would in controlling the TTP, or perhaps even resolving other long-standing regional issues. This goes back, I think, to the most important point that Fatima made, which was Iran looking at any ruling regime in Afghanistan and seeing core drivers of conflict that supersede the nature of the Afghan government. And that's true for all of Afghanistan's neighbors. Pakistan has problems with any Afghan government that it seems many in Pakistan believed they could just wave away because they had been a patron and supporter of the Taliban for so long. But this also goes to Niloufer's point. The most important thing for the Taliban among their own people, their own supporters, and the Afghan public is to try and prove that they are not some sort of foreign puppet. Hopefully, I can circle this back around to your question on the economics, which is, of course, Afghanistan is landlocked. And this is a core dilemma of the Taliban, trying to present themselves as authorities and as a government. They are dependent in so many ways, as every Afghan state has been, economically, politically, even the inability to completely fund their own state. The Taliban are making a run of it, but no Afghan government throughout history has been able to last long without direct foreign support. To balance that against an ideology where they have to constantly be insisting and thumping their chest, boasting about their independence, provides a real political dilemma. The only thing I'll say about the economic front is that trade has been smoothed in a number of ways with Iran. And it doesn't seem of the many tension points between Iran and the Taliban that trade has actually been jammed up. But we have not seen a vast increase in trade. Rather, that has come between Afghanistan and Pakistan. That could be for a variety of reasons. It might have had to do with India's cautiousness. As you noted, Chabahar Port, so much of what Iran's facilitation and trade might be relates to how India wants to posture on Afghanistan. But in any event, over the last 2 years, when you look at World Bank data, when you look at the rise and fall of imports and exports, the Taliban are sending their most valuable exports, such as coal, and also importing as much as they can from Pakistan. That's their true indispensable trading partner, at least for now. Thanks.
Thank you. Niloufer, you wanted to comment? Please go ahead.
Yeah, I just have a comment here in terms of the regional country. I think I missed answering your question also before. After the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, I see that there was kind of there was a perception of power vacuum. If there was not a power vacuum, at least there was a perception of power vacuum that all these countries in the region thought. The same with Iran. So Iran is, of course, more doing a lot on the economic front and security front with China, with the economic front with China and the security front with Russia. And Afghanistan and Taliban, at some point, it's an important element for Iran foreign policy, right? But Iran doesn't have a very concrete strategic foreign policy towards Afghanistan at this point, and Iran will not develop one in at least soon in near future. Why? Because Iran will see the regional alliance building in the region going forward in terms of who will side who. Pakistan, well, what the relationship between Pakistan, how the relationship between Pakistan and Taliban will evolve, how the relationship between China and the Taliban will evolve, and the same with Russia and Taliban. So far, we have seen that these countries have only one interest, and that is to contend, to limit the security threats that could emerge from Afghanistan by the Taliban as a ruling party. So that's the major interest. Why? Because for China, it is protection of its economic investment in the region, that it doesn't want anything from Afghanistan could spoil those engagements. There's all the economic investment plans that it has both in Pakistan, Central Asia, and around. For Russia, of course, Russia sees that as security threats that could spill over from the borders of the Central Asian countries, the states, and the same is with Iran. For Pakistan, there's a different calculation, as Andrew articulated very well. But for these countries, I think we have to wait and see. It's very early. Taliban is playing a two parallel, game at this point. They are playing very well, I think, from my analysis from last 2 years. They're playing well with their regional neighbors. Why? Because they want to maintain relationship. They want to create a narrative that they have built a better relationship with the neighboring countries, and the neighboring countries can support them, and that could add to their recognition, because they are seeking recognition. They're in the process of power consolidation. So they try to do well at this point. And second thing, I think Taliban recognize that Iran is a trading partner. And Afghanistan right now, under severe economic crisis, needs money from any aspect that comes in. So I think Taliban also will be careful in dealing with Iran going forward. Even I discussed before that they will be talking from a position of power, but there will be elements within the Taliban to contend any scenarios that could lead to violence. They would try to avoid that route at this point, because they need money, as I mentioned. They want the country to run. They want to sustain their regime. And on the other hand, they also want to show the world that they are becoming a politically active group in the region, and they could be trusted. So therefore, they will pursue the path of collaboration and engagement with all the countries in the region. And I think at this point, you will see less spoilers of the country, but the spoilers will be non-affiliated fighters and all the other transnational security, transnational terrorist groups. Those could be the spoilers of the relationships between the countries. I don't see the states being spoilers of the relationship between the countries at this point.
Thank you, Niloufar. We have about 5 minutes, so we're going to do one more round, hopefully. Please be short to the extent that you can. I'll return to Fatemeh. Fatemeh, I wanted to give you a question. I mean, everyone here pretty much, I think, if I understood you correctly, believe that for different reasons, Iran and Taliban do not want to go to war. But one of the questions is Iran supporting the Shias in Afghanistan militarily? I'm not so sure what specifically we're talking about here when we say the Shias, but to the extent that there is Iranian support, I know, for example, Ahmad Massoud from the National Resistance Front of Afghanistan, in just the last 2 weeks, in reference to the border skirmishes, kind of, had a jab at Tehran and said, you kind of working with Taliban, and this is what you get. And you should have listened to it. You should have never worked with the Taliban. But anyway, Fatemeh, your last words in terms of this issue of Iranian support for anti-Taliban forces in Afghanistan. How serious is it? How extensive it is? And perhaps you could say a few things in terms of predicting the next few weeks, months ahead in this relationship.
Sure. I've tried to make it as short as possible. Islamic Republic, the last thing Islamic Republic wants at this time is being engaged in a war with Afghanistan. And I still believe, I know I kind of have different opinion than the colleagues who spoke earlier. I still believe the security threat from Afghanistan is the most important thing concern for Iran, more than the fate of Shia Hazaras, more than even the drug trafficking or anything else. Security is the most important issue, concern for Iran. And they know that if a possible war with Afghanistan, first of all, they have learned their lesson. They have learned that any country that entered Afghanistan didn't come out well. They would not enter a war, a classical war that we know, just invading or taking troops there. They know that a possible, a war with Afghanistan would involve other, as Niloufar mentioned, spoilers and other countries. Don't think of the Saudi-Iran's improved relationship right now. We know that other rivals can get engaged, and fortunately, I think Iranians know at this point that they have to calm things down regarding water and border, as they have done in the past, not just during Taliban, also before in the clashes that happened before the Taliban seizing power. So I don't see a war right now, but the issue of water will not go away for any time soon, because as I mentioned, the Taliban doesn't have much regards for international law. I doubt they are willing to build an international group with the United Nations participation to decide, or they would be ever willing to review the agreement that existed from 1973. So I think things won't change for upcoming years time.
Thank you, Fatima. Let me turn to Andrew, and then Niloufar, you get the last word. But Andrew, one of the questions, this is the last question, unfortunately, I have time to bring in, is on the issue of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, an entity that includes Russia, China, Pakistan, India, Iran, is kind of on its way in last few steps. But I mean, regional initiatives that might exist as a mediating facility between Iran and Taliban, if you could comment on that, if such things exist. And one quick comment from me, I mean, last time Iran dealt with the Taliban, it found itself in an alliance with the like of Russia and India back in the Northern Alliance in the 1990s. I wonder what capacity Russia today has to be involved in Central Asia. I mean, they're busy fighting a war in Ukraine, which they consider existential. The reports I hear suggest that the Russians are pulling out troops from bases in like Tajikistan. So I just wonder, is Iran able to bank on the, recreating the anti-Taliban bloc that it managed to do back in the 1990s? But you get the last word here before we go to Niloufar. Anything you want to add, Andrew? Floor's yours.
Of course, thank you. I'll try to briefly move through. I just to agree fully first with Fatima. I tried to point to areas of security cooperation between Iran and the Taliban, but completely agreed. The way that Iran has behaved signals very clearly that security issues are their top concern over any of the other tension points that we might believe or that we see in the news today. Prevention of full-on security crisis is obviously driving Iran's engagement and behavior. When it comes to the region, whether it's SCO or any other regional forum, on the one hand, India and Pakistan, often being unable to get into the room together, have long prevented any true regional consensus and collective or cooperative action on Afghanistan. Russia, Alex, as you note, their capacity for any real engagement and effort and resources is completely sapped by Ukraine. They have demonstrated a desire to remain diplomatically active, engaging the region on how to move forward on Afghanistan policy. But this also gives evidence to the point I just raised. Earlier this year, Russia had to hold 2 different forums back to back. In one, they invited an envoy from Pakistan, and the other included an Indian official. So the region is going to continue to juggle that struggle. Of course, you have China, which would prefer to see itself as the hub and lead on regional efforts as well. That's not serious geopolitical competition between Russia and China, but in the diplomatic forum of of who gets credit for holding ceremonial summits, I think that will continue. It's unlikely to see the region really brought together in strong collective action against the Taliban. The US intervention is a testament to how difficult large-scale, heavy effort intervention really is. I think if anything still binds Iran, Russia, and China together, that includes Pakistan, it's the continued desire to not see US presence come and interfere in the region. So even 2+ years after the US began to withdraw, what binds them all together is the hope to make sure that the Taliban doesn't grow stronger relations with the United States than it does with them. I'll close there.
Thank you, Andrew. Niloufar, we're over time, but take a minute or two, comment on anything you'd like to sort of wrap up with. I guess my one question for you, and I'm trying to push us in the direction of hope. Countries like Iran and Saudi Arabia are now engaged in a de-escalation process of detente. The Qataris are busy mediating between Iran and the United States. The Qataris are probably among the most powerful foreign voices that the Taliban listens to. Could you see a situation where the Islamic world comes together and has some kind of a genuine initiative among Muslim states to perhaps make Taliban tone it down on things like girls' education, but also mediate when necessary, like between Iran and the Taliban over this water issue? Again, this is my attempt to end today with some kind of a hopeful note, but maybe I'm wrong in thinking along those lines. So Niloufar, you get the last word.
Well, that has failed, by the way. The Islamic countries, they came together in a couple of events from last couple of years in order to make Taliban work on some of the wants and demands that they have, especially on the girls' education and women at work, but they failed. So that prescription, I think that did not work. Unfortunately for the Taliban, Alice, let me point out one thing. This is a very complex situation. The countries are dealing with an unrecognized, illegitimate government, all right? So even if there's some sort of agreement, it's difficult to sign the agreement. So there's always the regulatory problem also right now in the region with the Taliban in power. Because even let's say about water, if the scenario is that okay, they agree on something, they want to develop and form and sign an agreement internationally, that's not possible. Because even the signature cannot happen. The regulatory process cannot happen. So this is a complex situation, especially when you have a unrecognized, illegitimate government in power next door. You don't know how to deal with it. So I don't blame sometimes the regional countries. They are at the state of confusion at this point. At some point, that's why they're unable to develop and cement their policy of engagement with Afghanistan at this point. It's all about ad hoc engagement, humanitarian assistance, and all this, but they are not able to frame well their policy of engagement with Afghanistan because of the nature of the ruling party that I mentioned. The second thing, I think the regional initiative you highlighted, I haven't been very positive about the regional events happened from last couple of years around Afghanistan and for the security of the region. They haven't been so effective, unfortunately. First, because of some of the disturbances or tension that existed among the countries in the region that did not allow all to participate in one events. So in one event, you could see one of the regional actors was missing. In the other event, the second was missing. So inclusion was a major issue in all the regional events from last couple of years. And when one party from the regional negotiation table is missing, you should not expect a concrete result towards the resolution of that conflict. And the issues such as border crisis, water crisis, security spillover from Afghanistan, they were always at the agenda of these regional events with a statement, but without a concrete plan of action.
Right.
Therefore, I would say they were the formal events which did not shape into concrete plan for implementation, and also because of the differences of view about some of the major themes and issues, the countries never came together around a concrete plan of action to address some of the issues that we mentioned here, especially in relation to security and border crisis. So I think the regional event should be more systematic going forward, and inclusion of all countries should be the requirement of that. And this 101 negotiations, as you mentioned, between Saudis and Iranian and Qatar and others, they could be, I think, they could be used as a positive aspects towards the field of peacemaking, that things can be possible. The long-term tensions could be resolved if there are political will to go forward. So I think there is possibility, taking as a positive note, there is possibility, and talking from peacemaking perspective, if these regional efforts would be more systematic and more inclusion could be the requirement of one of this. Plus, there will be more political will from our parties to resolve particular tension among them. I stop there.
Thank you, Niloufar. I actually thought that was a very good sort of attempt at injecting some hope here. So I do see a possible pathway forward. But I want to thank you all. I want to thank Dr. Niloufar Sakhi, Fatima Aman, and Andrew Watkins. You've been very generous with your time, your insights. Thanks to the audience for all the good questions. I tried to include as many of those into the conversation as possible. But as you heard, this Iran-Afghanistan relationship and Iran-Taliban relationship, there's a lot of historical context. There are a lot of different factors. You have an Iranian state that has not paid attention sufficiently, from what I can tell, to the issues of Afghanistan and important neighbors of Iran being occupied elsewhere. The Taliban is still very much in a transition process. They haven't matured. Whether they will mature or not remains to be seen. And the region would have to wait for that day before they can maybe, perhaps in a hopeful moment, get together and look for collective solutions to some of these problems that exist. But I'm sure we can return to this issue later on at the Middle East Institute, invite wonderful panelists we had today. But for now, thank you again for joining us. I wish you all a wonderful weekend, and until next time, bye-bye.